I'll be putting the tariff of 25% on Canada and separately 25% on Mexico. And we will really have to do that because we have very big deficits with those countries. Those tariffs may or may not rise with time.
Okay, Rosemary Barton is the CBC's chief political correspondent, and she's here with me now. Rosie, we weren't planning to do this today, but then he did this thing in the Oval Office.
Yep.
May rise over time. That's a whole new flavor to this conversation. What do we take away from what he said now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a concerning phrase for government officials. I would say that he said may or may not rise over time.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Without trying to mind read the president, because that would be difficult, I would say that we don't know where this is going. He did again, though, point to Saturday as the day where this tariff will be announced. I don't know if it would be implemented as of Saturday. And he pointed to those three issues that he continues to see problems with: migration, fentanyl, and trade deficits or subsidies, as he calls them, to Canada and Mexico. So he laid out the case again. I think the fact that he reiterated the Saturday date is probably disconcerting for Canadian government officials here. They don't really know what's happening. I think that's the nicest way to put it. They don't have a line of sight into the Oval Office, and they point to the fact that they have not ever gotten warnings. Back when he mentioned this on January 20th, there was no warning then either. So this is at least more evidence that he plans to forge ahead with this plan. What it looks like on Saturday, whether it is another threat, a piece of paper outlining what he wants, whether he will point to specifics, whether he will put a date in the future so that Canada and Mexico have some time to negotiate, all things that are very much up in the air.
There was also conversation today about whether oil will be part of this, right? A reporter asked him, and there was a confusing exchange, which I couldn't tell if he was talking about tariffs or whether oil is part of the trade deficit. But he said he was going to decide tonight, basically, whether or not it would apply to oil, and suggested it depends on the price of a barrel of oil.
Yeah, I mean, just to give people an idea of how fluid this is, it doesn't sound like he's fully made up his mind on some of this. When he was asked about oil, he said, we've got enough oil. He also said that, something he's been repeating for the past couple of weeks as well, but that he would consider, if oil was a fair price from Canada, that perhaps it would not be subject to these tariffs. Remember, 80% of our oil is sold to the United States. If there's a tariff on that, we have a big, big problem on our hands. I don't know who he's talking to tonight and where that conversation is going, but he said that that is something he'll make his mind up on later tonight. Remember, we learned that just yesterday, the Canadian government sent a video down to Howard Lutnick after his confirmation yesterday to try and give some evidence that they have made progress at the border. Were there helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters in those images? What did they show at the crossings when it comes to migration? We don't know. And in fact, we don't know that Howard Lutnick actually showed that to the president or anybody else at this stage either.
Right, but it's fascinating to see that they're doing, like, we call it like a CBSA sizzle reel. Like, this is what they have to resort to, right? And Daniel Smith had a Fox News crew down around Coutts, Alberta. They sent a Black Hawk over there to sort of do this show of strength, because if you look at what Lutnick said yesterday, they've divided these tariffs into two phases, right? February 1 is about getting action on the border, and then April 1 is about this larger restructuring of trade and the way it affects the American economy and American manufacturing.
And listen, I think the least that the Canadian government is hoping for now is that that is the case, that there are two phases to this, and that they can continue to buy themselves time. But imagine having to govern your own country at a time when the president is constantly making threats and suggesting things that you should do in order to avoid them. Let's just point to Colombia, where he made a threat to Colombia if they didn't take the people that he had deported. That is something that is on the table here. Does he lay out a little more clearly what happens if we don't get to wherever he wants on some of these issues? I think this has made governing this country incredibly challenging, and I think the next 24, 36 hours here are going to be very intense for the country.
Yeah, Daniel Smith has put out a statement saying they're monitoring the situation. We'll have more to say when the White House announces its decision. In the meantime, the Premier reiterates her call to the federal government to immediately appoint a qualified border czar to coordinate a joint U.S.-Canada crackdown on fentanyl and legal migration at our shared border. Well, I mean, there is a public safety minister, there's an immigration minister, Dominic LeBlanc.
There's a commissioner of the RCMP. There's many people in charge of the border. I'm not sure adding another person to that layer would be the one thing that convinces Donald Trump.
It'd be a quick hiring process to get it done between now and Saturday, too, and have that person in place to do it. Okay, just as a final question, I mean, we still, like the chaos component of this and the unknowns are high. Do we have a sense of how the government will respond right away? You know, if something does happen on Saturday, which seems more likely, I think, based on this.
I mean, I will tell you that this morning, after having listened to Howard Lutnick yesterday, I was feeling a little bit more optimistic for the country, and now Donald Trump has spoken, and I'm back to where I was. A couple of things. If it is just another threat, the Canadian government will just continue working away, trying to convince him otherwise. If it is a threat with an implementation date, then the Canadian government will really have to start moving on in terms of consulting on what the exact counter tariffs are.
Right.
If it's a date when the tariffs will be in place, Canada will have to match that immediately. Like as soon as we know the date, match the date. Yeah. As soon as Donald Trump puts that on the table. So there's a variety of scenarios here. What is clear, though, is that as they wait to see what happens on Saturday, the Prime Minister will be working, Dominic LeBlanc will be working, and we should expect response very, very quickly from people.
Okay, Rosie, thank you so much. So we've seen a lot of announcements and a lot of action. Are we seeing results yet? Have you seen anything to suggest quantifiable change in what's been happening at the border since this push was been made to satisfy Donald Trump?
Yeah, certainly. Speaking from a CBSA point of view, I think we've seen an impact in terms of the measures that are being taken. So, just for example, in terms of removals, we got funding through the fall economic statement to increase the number of removals we're doing, and we've started to track progress in terms of had a good year last year where we did about 15 to 16,000 removals last year, and we're trying to increase our pace the first 3 months of this year to increase that by about 1,000. We're well on track to do that, and then increase that even further as the year goes on. So I think you're starting to see that progress, and you can see what our colleagues in the RCMP are doing in terms of deploying equipment like helicopters and drones to patrol between the ports. So yeah, I think we're starting to see the difference.
Okay, so the threat, of course, is tariffs on Saturday, on February 1st, if the border situation isn't solved to the president's satisfaction. His Commerce Secretary nominee has suggested that this could all be avoided if the border action is swift and strong enough. How will we know? Is it just a subjective judgment by the U.S., or do you think, is there a data metric you can point to, along with your RCMP partners and others, that you've hit these targets and this has been the net change at the Canada-U.S. border?
Yeah, I'll play my role. My role is enforcement, and we're going to continue doing what we do, which is enforcing the laws, especially in terms of the nexus with the border. And we're going to continue what we're doing, and I think it'll be for others to judge whether that's sufficient. I think we're doing the right thing, and I think we're doing a good job. I just think in the last month, and again, I think you have to think about this from a Fortress North America point of view, because when we're stopping goods coming into Canada, we're also stopping goods or people that might be making their way southbound. So just in the last month, if I think some of the significant seizures we've had, I think it was around 180, 190 kilograms of cocaine in Coutts, Alberta. The Toronto Police Services seized over 800 kilograms of cocaine in the Toronto area. In the Cornwall area, OPP and CBSA, the RCMP, stopped a human smuggling event involving 8 people that were looking to go southbound. Just last week, our own folks in the Niagara region stopped an individual crossing illegally from the United States in the Niagara region. So every day we're making a difference, whether it's on the kind of the land border or on the North American perimeter, to stop things coming into Canada or to stop things going into the United States. And I think doing that is making a difference. And then it's also working with our partners in the United States. So for example, we've increased the number of intelligence officers we have working with US CBP. We had 2 in their National Targeting Center before Christmas. We've increased the number working with them by another 2. And that makes a big difference in terms of our joint efforts to target goods and people coming into the country. At the same time, the US CBP is bringing people to our targeting center.
Right, so you mentioned cocaine, though, as being intercepted, and as important as that may be, it's fentanyl that concerns the president. I know the volumes of fentanyl that are actually believed to be flowing from Canada to the U.S. are small compared to what is coming from Mexico to the United States. But I know some BMK, some precursor for narcotics, was intercepted, but what about on the fentanyl issue? What's your sense of whether there's been a measurable, demonstrable progress that you can show to the U.S. authorities?
I think, and I think that's where our colleagues in the RCMP have a lot to say in terms of the work they've done and dismantling some of the super labs that are out there. That's making a difference. And again, the two when we put resources with US CBP in part, it's to tackle issues like fentanyl. So it's a sustained and coordinated effort that we're engaged in. You're right, we're not a significant source of fentanyl. But the real issue behind that is the transnational organized crime groups that are profiting from the illegal trade. So whether it's cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, they're making profits off of these illegal drugs. And every time we tackle them, every time we disrupt their trade, we're having an impact. And I think we all benefit from that.
Right, that's a fair point. And that's how the cocaine bust may, in fact, fit into that particular picture that you were talking about there. I wonder, though, there are reports, and I don't know if you had anything to do with the creation of these videos, but it's like a sizzle reel from the Canadian government being sent to the president and the people around him to show the arrests and the enforcements, the action. I presume the Blackhawks and the drones are featured in that. I don't know if you have any sense how that's being received politically, but in terms of the efforts you're making, I know you do speak with your counterparts on the American side of the border, I would presume with some consistency. What are you hearing from them in terms of their assessment of what Canada has been doing?
You're absolutely right. We do engage continually with our counterparts on the U.S. side, and again, I think there's that shared interest that we have to tackle irregular migration, to tackle human smuggling, to tackle the smuggling of illegal drugs. So, just a couple of weeks ago, I was down in Washington having conversations around how can we collaborate with American counterparts to improve our ability to remove people from our respective countries. Because one of the risks that we often see is you'll see individuals seeking to flee American efforts to remove, they come to Canada and vice versa. So by coordinating on removal efforts, we actually both win. And I think there's a willingness on the American side to do just that.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next, because the deportations have started in the United States, right? These aggressive raids have begun in some of the larger centers. We saw the issue with Colombia and the dispute overtaking repatriation flights of people who are being deported. What are you seeing in terms of possible migrant movement from the United States toward the Canadian border? This was the big concern, that it could lead to a flood of people, resurrecting multiple Roxham Road scenarios. What are you seeing on that front? What are you hearing from south of the border?
To date, we're not seeing any significant change in terms of the number of people arriving and making asylum claims in Canada, either at the airports or at the land borders. But that doesn't mean we're not getting ready. So we are aggressively getting ready in terms of that possible northbound surge that I've talked about before, the plans that we've developed, the resources that we're pre-deploying. So we're getting ready, but we haven't seen anything materialize yet.
Are you getting a sense of traffic at all inside the United States, of migrants preparing to make that move? Because, it's what, he's been in power a little over a week. Things are moving at a breakneck pace, but sometimes humans are slower to move on these things. Is it still your sense that Canada could potentially face something like this, or is maybe the initial concerns about that been a little bit overblown? What do you think?
I think we're being prudent. We're taking the precautionary approach. That possibility exists, and we're preparing for it. We haven't seen it materialize yet, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. And we're doing our best to make sure that we're ready if it does materialize.
Okay. Aaron McCrory with the CBSA. Well, I always appreciate your time. Thanks for being here today, sir.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.